At 18 years old, Margaret Wilson faced the tide as if it were a courtroom. Welcome to the debate. We are looking at a moment in history that has been crystallized by a very specific, powerful promise, which is at 18, she did not bow.
Right, she refused.
Exactly. And that is the reason her name is still spoken over 3 centuries later. When her conscience and her faith were placed under extreme, basically inescapable pressure, she refused to submit. So I really want to pose the guiding tension of our discussion today. Why did Margaret Wilson refuse to bow?
Well, I approach this from a fundamentally different angle, I think, because when I look at the history of Scotland in 1685, I have to ask, was Margaret Wilson literally asked to deny Christ, or was the issue a deeply complex political religious oath?
Okay.
Because, those are two entirely different mechanisms of power. We have to ask, was she truly a religious martyr in the pure sense? Or was she, at least in the cold eyes of the state, a political dissident defying royal authority during an insurgency?
I mean, I struggle to see how you can frame her execution as a purely political act when the state was actively offering her a theological pardon.
A theological pardon?
Yes, I argue that Margaret Wilson's refusal was a stance of absolute religious conscience. Her decision was anchored entirely in the convictions of the Scottish Covenanters. They had sworn in the National Covenant that Christ alone is the head of the Church.
Right, the covenant.
So, to Margaret, swearing the state's abjuration oath wasn't just a pledge of civil loyalty, it explicitly meant taking the crown of the Church and placing it onto the head of a mortal king. She was choosing theological fidelity over her own biological survival.
It's easy to view this exclusively through a theological lens, but I think that obscures the reality of state coercion during what history calls the killing time.
Between 1680 and 1688.
Exactly. To King Charles II and subsequently King James II, this was absolutely a matter of national security. It was about civil obedience and suppressing open rebellion. The state viewed the Covenanters' hidden outdoor worship services, the conventicles, as illegal, seditious gatherings.
But calling them seditious is a stretch when they just wanted to worship.
From the government's perspective, though, Margaret was prosecuted as a political fugitive, defying royal authority in a highly volatile militarized region. It wasn't just about faith to them.
Well, let's break down what the head of the church actually meant in the 17th century, because I think a modern listener might dismiss this as a petty semantic dispute.
Yeah, it sounds like splitting hairs to us today.
Right, but why did the Scottish Covenanters care so much? We have to go back to 1660, to the restoration of King Charles II. When he took the throne, he essentially tore up the national covenant. He declared himself supreme over all persons and in all causes, including the church. He demanded that every minister accept royal authority or be cast out. Around 300 ministers walked away from their pulpits, their homes, their incomes, rather than acknowledge any king but Christ over the church.
And that is exactly where the politics take over, because those ministers didn't just quietly retire, right? Their congregations followed them into the hills.
Which they had the right to do.
But to King Charles, allowing Christ to be the sole head of the church wasn't just a difference of theological opinion. It was a constitutional loophole for treason. If the king isn't the head of the church, then the king cannot control what the ministers preach on Sunday mornings.
And he wanted absolute control.
Exactly. And if he cannot control the pulpits, he cannot control the masses. So it inherently becomes a political threat.
But you are treating this as if Margaret Wilson was some political strategist plotting against the crown. She was a teenager. She grew up on a farm in Galloway. Her father, Gilbert Wilson, was a farmer of decent standing who outwardly conformed to the state church.
Likely to protect his land and family, yeah?
Of course, but Margaret, her brother Thomas, and her little sister Agnes, who was literally a child, refused to conform. They internalized this theological conviction that no earthly king had the right to rule the Church of Jesus Christ. They were children of conscience, not insurgents.
I simply don't buy that the local magistrates saw it that way. The state was terrified of civil war. When those expelled ministers went out into the moors, they began drawing thousands of people.
For preaching. For field preaching.
Yes, but these conventicles became heavily armed gatherings. The Covenanters posted armed sentries to fight off the king's dragoons. By the time we get to the 1680s,
The state declares that attending a field preaching is a capital offense.
Because they wanted to break their spirits.
Because to the crown, a conventicle was not a Sunday school picnic, It was a rebel militia in the making. The local magistrates viewed anyone attending them, even a teenager, as a threat to the fragile peace of the kingdom.
If they were truly treating them as an armed militia, then look at how absurdly the state applied that fear. The Wilsons were farm children. They spent their days gathering sheep. Yet because the law demanded that everyone attend the official state-sanctioned church and swear the required oaths, these youths became fugitives.
Which is undeniably tragic.
It is. Margaret, Thomas, and Agnes fled to the bogs and caves of Galloway. The state didn't just hunt them. They punished their father, Gilbert, who wasn't even allowed to shelter his own children without facing financial ruin.
The systematic coercion of the family unit was definitely part of the state's strategy. They quartered soldiers on Gilbert's farm and drained his livelihood with fines. It was a calculated method to turn families against each other.
Absolutely. But this brings us to the trial of Margaret and Agnes, which I think perfectly reveals the true nature of the state's machinery. On April 13, 1685, they are brought before a commission of judges in Wigtown, including the notorious Sir Robert Grierson of Log. And the charges read against them are incredibly revealing.
Right, they were charged with rebellion, attending more than 20 forbidden field meetings, and, this is the wild part, being present at the battles of Bothwell Bridge and Aird's Moss.
Which is historically absurd on its face. The Battle of Bothwell Bridge took place in 1679. Margaret would have been about 12 years old.
And Agnes would have been 7, exactly. You do not bring a 7-year-old up on charges of armed rebellion at a major battlefield unless the charges are a complete fabrication designed for a different purpose. This is exactly where I argue that the abjuration oath was weaponized.
Weaponized how?
It was a tool of terror. The state did not genuinely believe a teenage girl and a child fought at Bothwell Bridge. They only cared that she wouldn't submit to the oath right there in the courtroom. It was about forcing compliance.
See, I actually think the absurdity of the charges proves my point rather than yours. The judges knew the girls weren't combatants, but they offered them a stark way out. Just swear the abjuration oath.
Right. Swear it and live.
Swear it and live. The oath required them to renounce the covenant and acknowledge the king's supreme spiritual authority. The state was essentially saying, we will drop these fabricated political charges if you just yield your theology. They demanded her conscience, and Margaret refused to give it.
I think a modern listener is probably screaming at their phone right now, Just lie, just take the oath, cross your fingers, go back to your farm and live your life.
Oh, for sure.
To a modern secular mindset, dying over a verbal pledge seems baffling. But we have to understand the mechanics of how the abjuration oath worked in the 17th century's psychological framework.
Exactly. An oath wasn't a terms and conditions box that you blindly checked. To swear the abjuration oath was to invoke the eternal, living God as a witness to your submission.
It carried eternal weight.
Yes, in their theological reality, swearing a false oath to God meant literal, inescapable damnation. The state understood this perfectly. They weaponized the Covenanters' own theology against them. The calculation forced upon Margaret was brutally clear.
Which was what?
If you swear the oath, you live biologically, but you burn eternally. If you refuse, you die biologically, but you inherit eternal life.
And the way the state trapped them illustrates how pervasive this coercion was. Margaret, who is now 18, and 13-year-old Agnes had quietly gone into Wigtown after a period of hiding. They didn't engage in a firefight. They were betrayed by a man named Patrick Stewart.
Right.
He trapped them with a very common, very subtle test of loyalty at the time. He invited them to drink the king's health.
A social custom that was completely loaded with political and religious supremacy. As Covenanters, they politely declined, and that simple act of declining a drink was enough for Stewart to turn them over to the authorities.
Unbelievable.
They were arrested, along with a 63-year-old widow named Margaret McClellan, who was reportedly taken while she was on her knees in prayer. They were all thrown into the thieves' hole, which was a foul, freezing dungeon reserved for the worst criminals in the region.
The bureaucracy of extortion really accelerates here, too. The court sentences all three of them, the 63-year-old, the 18-year-old, and the 13-year-old, to be tied to stakes in the tidal waters of the Bladnoch River and drowned.
Just an unthinkable sentence.
But the state, showing its true financial motives, allows Gilbert Wilson to ransom his youngest daughter, Agnes. He pledges £100
which was a crushing, almost unimaginable sum for a farmer in 17th century Galloway. It financially ruined him.
But Gilbert doesn't stop there. He rides desperately to Edinburgh to plead with the highest authorities for the lives of his older daughter, Margaret, and the widow, Margaret McLachlan. And this introduces one of the most fascinating historical mysteries of this entire narrative.
The official reprieve?
The official reprieve.
Yeah, on April 30th, 1685, the Privy Council in Edinburgh actually recorded an order delaying the execution of the two women. The council books show a recommendation that they be pardoned.
So the highest authority in the land put mercy on paper.
They did. Yet, 11 days later, on May 11th, the execution in Wigtown went forward anyway.
So why did Wigtown proceed? Was the reprieve delayed by the chaotic, muddy travel conditions of 17th century Scotland? Was it simply lost in the bureaucratic shuffle? Or was it deliberately suppressed by local officials like Grierson of Legg and Major Wyndham?
Given the historical context, deliberate suppression seems incredibly likely. I mean, the central government in Edinburgh might have realized that executing teenagers and elderly widows was terrible for public optics.
Oh, absolutely terrible.
But the local commanders in Galloway were fighting what they perceived as a guerrilla war. They needed the terror. They needed the public spectacle to break the morale of the Covenanters in their own backyard.
Which forces us to look at the execution itself on May 11th, 1685. The method they chose is deeply revealing of the state's intent.
Think about what a tide actually is in the context of an execution. The drop of a gallows is instantaneous. The firing squad is a fraction of a second. But the Solway tide is a courtroom with no walls.
Wow. A courtroom with no walls.
It is slow. It is agonizingly patient. It gives you hours to stare at your impending death, offering a continuous, open window to simply say a few words, recant your beliefs, and walk back to dry land. The physical environment itself was used to maximize the pressure on the human conscience.
And the authorities placed the stakes with calculated psychological cruelty. They tied the 63-year-old widow Margaret McLachlan farther out in the channel. They placed 18-year-old Margaret Wilson closer to the shore.
So she would have to watch.
Yes, the explicit goal was that the younger woman would be forced to watch the older woman drowned first. The state banked on the assumption that the sheer horror of watching the sea swallow the elderly widow would shatter the 18-year-old's resolve.
As the water reached the older woman, one of the tormentors on the shore mocked Margaret Wilson. He called out, asking what she thought of the sight before her. Margaret's memorialized answer is the defining thesis of her life.
What did she say?
She said, "What do I see but Christ in one of his members wrestling there? Think you that we are the sufferers? No, it is Christ in us."
It is a remarkable psychological defense mechanism. The state is trying to project terror, isolation, and death into her mind. And by cognitively reframing the older woman's drowning as a spiritual victory, she is completely rejecting the state's narrative of the event. She built a mental fortress against the coercion.
Well, I disagree with the term psychological defense mechanism, because reframing makes it sound like a mental trick she played on herself to cope with trauma.
You think it was more than that?
For her, it wasn't a trick. It was ultimate reality. She genuinely saw the presence of the Lord Jesus, relying on the biblical promise from the Gospel of Matthew, "Lo, I am with you always." She believed Christ was actively carrying the suffering with his servant. As the freezing water reached her own ankles, she didn't panic. Witnesses recorded that she sang.
She sang Psalm 25 in the Scottish metrical version. "Let not mine enemies triumph over me. Remember not the sins of my youth."
The sins of my youth. She was 18. She would never leave her youth.
She also recited from the 8th chapter of Romans. These were the exact verses that sustained the Covenanters hiding on the moors, that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers shall be able to separate us from the love of God.
But the state wasn't done with her. Before the sea could finish its work, the historical record presents the most intense human tragedy of this entire event. The soldiers actually pulled her up out of the water.
They hauled her up, gasping, freezing, half-drowned, and they gave her one last chance to submit.
The crowd is pressing in on the riverbank. The townspeople, people who likely knew her family, are begging her to just say the words. Just say it, Margaret, and live. Someone in the crowd shouts out that she is willing to conform, begging her to just say a simple phrase, God save the king.
Right.
Her response in this chaotic, terrifying moment is incredibly nuanced. She doesn't scream a rebellion. She says, God save him if he will, for it is his salvation I desire.
That moment completely dismantles the state's argument that she was a hateful, seditious rebel. An 18-year-old girl, freezing and traumatized, still has the immense theological precision to distinguish between a prayer for a man's soul and a political oath of supremacy.
It's incredible clarity under pressure.
It really is. She wishes for the king's salvation as a human being. It is a profoundly pastoral statement. She is essentially saying, I do not hate the king. I pray for him, but I will not surrender the church to him.
But for Major Wyndham, pastoral nuance was worthless. The state machinery requires total, unambiguous submission. He steps forward and demands that she swear the full abjuration oath.
The oath that would legally place the crown of the church onto the head of a man. And Margaret gives her final answer, I will not, I am one of Christ's children, let me go.
Not let me live, but let me go.
Exactly, let me go. The soldiers thrust her back into the water, and she drowns.
It raises a chilling question about the absolute limits of state power. Was she ultimately executed for what she did, or for what she refused to think? She wasn't carrying a weapon. She wasn't plotting an assassination.
No, not at all.
She simply refused to align her internal conscience with the state's required ideological framework. When you strip away the 17th century context, the state executed an 18-year-old girl for a thought crime.
Precisely. And that is why her story has endured so powerfully. At 18, her courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was her absolute reliance on something greater than the state's terror. It was her conviction that Christ is king, not a king who shares his throne, and not a king subject to the approval of human governments.
The aftermath of this event proves that the state's strategy of terror completely failed too. The men responsible, particularly Sir Robert Grierson of Logg, carried the stain of that day for the rest of their lives. They became historical bywords for cruelty in Scottish memory.
And the political landscape shifted shortly after.
Right. Within 3 years, in 1688, the persecuting regime collapsed. King James was driven from the throne. The attempt to crush the Covenanters through sheer brutality just did not work.
And the church that held to the core convictions Margaret died for was reestablished. The cause that seemed drowned in the Solway rose victorious. Today there are monuments on Windy Hill above Wigtown and a stone pillar down near the river. In 1871, John Everett Millay painted The Martyr of the Solway, immortalizing that image of a young woman bound, waiting for the tide.
Margaret Wilson's story is a profound historical touchstone. I think it demands a sober reflection on the extreme dangers of state coercion. What happens when the machinery of power demands the total surrender of the soul?
It's a terrifying thought.
It forces us to ask where the boundary lies between the authority of the state, the instinct for biological survival, and the sanctity of individual conscience. She was 18 years old. Life was exactly one sentence away, and she chose the water.
The tide still rises in the Solway twice a day, every day, just as it did on the 11th of May, 1685. The sea took her body, but her refusal to bow remains an enduring question for anyone who faces a tide of pressure. We leave you to draw your own conclusions about the boundaries between authority, survival, and the soul.